Have you ever experienced that incredible moment where your inner critic just completely vanishes? You know the feeling. The relentless, exhausting chatter in your head goes totally silent. Time starts to get weird, hours feel like minutes, yet somehow your reaction time is razor sharp. You're tackling a really complex challenge, but the work itself feels almost entirely effortless. Well, I'm here to tell you that this isn't some mystical trance, and it definitely isn't a random stroke of luck. What you're experiencing is a quantifiable, neurologically distinct state of optimal human performance. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive deep and decode the exact science of the flow state.
So let's look at our modern reality for a second. We are enduring an absolute barrage of cognitive input every single day. In fact, research suggests we process up to 70,000 thoughts a single day. That constant stimulation physically taxes the brain. Think about the attention fragmentation, the chronic stress, the severe digital overload. It all keeps our nervous systems on high alert, creating this biologically exhausting environment that severely degrades our micromental health. Now, most of us naturally assume that to overcome this, to achieve peak performance or deep work, we just need to push harder. We need to grip the steering wheel tighter and exert maximum conscious effort, right? But the latest neurobiology actually reveals a stunning paradox. To reach peak cognitive efficiency, the brain requires its highest, most advanced control centers to actually power down. So what if the secret to ultimate control is actually surrendering it?
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The peak performance paradox, 2. Psychology of the zone, 3. Neuroscience of transient hypofrontality, 4. The brain-heart connection, 5. Neurosynchrony and team flow, and finally, 6. Mastering the flow cycle.
Let's jump right into part 1, the peak performance paradox, control through surrender. To really understand flow, we have to look at our default waking state, which is incredibly burdened. Thanks to constant notifications and just the sheer complexity of modern life, our normal brains are frankly clogged with information. We kind of exist on this unconscious repeat, constantly anticipating future calamities or ruminating on past mistakes. And let me tell you, this constant looping is highly metabolically expensive. It consumes vast amounts of glucose and energy just to keep that baseline anxiety running. But the most debilitating part, it's our rampant inner critic. It just sits there in the background, continuously analyzing, questioning, and doubting everything we do. This isn't just an annoyance, it's a massive biological drain on our finite mental bandwidth, which leaves us totally exhausted before we even attempt to do any deep, meaningful work.
Moving on to part 2, psychology of the zone, mapping optimal experience.
Okay, so pioneering psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi actually spent his entire life studying how humans find optimal experience and true intrinsic happiness. And he ultimately mapped out the exact sweet spot of human capability. As you can see, it exists in this precise diagonal channel where two variables perfectly intersect: the difficulty of a challenge and your personal level of skill. The exact sweet spot, what we call the flow channel, only happens when a high challenge perfectly matches your high level of skill. If the challenge is too high for your current ability, you're going to fall into a state of anxiety and stress. But if your skill is too high for the task, you drop right into boredom and apathy. So flow requires that perfect Goldilocks level of friction between your abilities and the task in front of you. And when you hit that sweet spot, a really distinct set of characteristics emerge. Your action and your awareness merge into one continuous stream. You get this complete, almost intoxicating level of concentration. Your sense of self-consciousness, that inner critic we talked about, entirely evaporates. Time distorts, which is something neuroscientists actually call tachypsychia. But most importantly, the experience becomes autotelic. That's just a fancy way of saying the activity becomes intrinsically rewarding in itself. From a neurobiological standpoint, this intrinsic motivation fundamentally alters your dopamine signaling compared to when you're just chasing an external reward. You're no longer doing the task just for a paycheck or for validation. You're doing it because the execution is its own profound neurochemical reward.
Which brings us to part 3, neuroscience of transient hypofrontality, rewiring the brain. Now, this is where the science gets really, really cool. The crucial mechanism here is called transient hypofrontality. This hypothesis, which was championed by Dr. Arne Dietrich, treats the brain as this incredibly complex engine with finite metabolic resources. During highly demanding tasks, it has to reallocate those resources. Let's break the word down. Transient means temporary. Hypo means to slow down or downregulate, and frontality refers to the prefrontal cortex. So to achieve flow, your brain literally shuts off its highest cognitive centers. The parts responsible for self-monitoring, complex decision-making, and that nagging inner critic get powered down. Think about the evolutionary brilliance of that energy reallocation. Your brain is deliberately sacrificing self-awareness to dedicate maximum computational power to the exact task at hand.
If we look at this at a network level, it's basically a beautiful biological tug-of-war. Your default mode network, or DMN, is where you spend most of your day. It's active when you're daydreaming, but it's also the main engine of self-referential rumination and doubt. In the context of micromental health, having an overactive DMN is heavily linked to clinical anxiety and depression in modern adults. It keeps you trapped in those debilitating what-if scenarios. While flow provides a literal biological break from this network, it forces a massive downregulation of the DMN and a massive upregulation of your central executive network, or task-positive network. The brain literally shifts gears, shutting down the networks of anxiety and firing up the networks of external, goal-directed action.
And the physical reward for making this network shift is just a staggering neurochemical cascade. When you enter flow, your brain is flooded with a highly specific cocktail of performance-enhancing neurochemicals. First, dopamine floods the striatum, dramatically improving the signal-to-noise ratio in your brain, sharpening your focus and pattern recognition to an elite level. Then, norepinephrine spikes your arousal and attention. You also get a surge of anandamide, which is often called the bliss molecule, reducing fear and boosting lateral thinking by widening your associative database, letting you connect totally disparate ideas effortlessly. On top of that, endorphins block out physical pain and fatigue, and finally, serotonin glides in to provide that deep, lasting sense of post-flow satisfaction. It is quite literally a biological high perfectly engineered to sustain deep work.
Part 4. The Brain-Heart Connection, Physiology of the Zone.
So, flow isn't just in your head, it's deeply connected to your cardiovascular system. Heart rate variability, or HRV, is the master indicator of your autonomic flexibility. It's simply the variation in time between your consecutive heartbeats. When your sympathetic nervous system, your fight-or-flight response, is dominant, your HRV actually decreases. Your heart beats like a rigid, stressed-out metronome. And in our modern lifestyle, chronic stress locks so many of us into this sympathetic dominance, literally destroying our physiological capability to enter flow states. But when your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest system takes over, your HRV increases. High HRV means your body is highly adaptable, recovering well, and feeling physiologically safe enough to drop into optimal cognitive performance.
And the science gets absolutely fascinating when we look at the bottom-up reality of these interconnected health systems. We used to think the brain just bossed the heart around, right? But recent studies show that high-amplitude oscillations in your heart rate actually send signals back up to the brain. Through the massive data superhighway known as the vagus nerve, rhythmic, highly variable heartbeats physically strengthen the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, meaning your heart's physiological rhythm is directly dictating your brain's capacity for emotional regulation, cognitive control, and emotional resilience. It's all connected.
Part 5. Neural synchrony and team flow. The group mind.
So what happens when a collective group enters the zone together? A landmark neuroscience study published in the journal eNeuro actually put this shared state to the test. They used a cooperative rhythm video game called O2 Jam U and hooked players up to EEG and MRI machines to map their brainwaves in real time. And what they found was wild. They proved that when a team hits the zone together, their individual brainwaves literally synchronize. They found increased beta-gamma power in the middle temporal cortex, which is an information integration hub. It is absolutely profound to consider that individual human nervous systems can biologically link up. It effectively proves that the group mind is not just some corporate buzzword concept. It is a measurable physiological reality.
And to put a mathematical proof on this, researchers use a really specific metric called mean global norm phase locking value to measure this inter-brain synchrony. When people in the study were just socializing or working in parallel but not in a flow state, their value was basically 0, or even slightly negative. But during verified team flow, that number spiked to exactly 0.002. This mathematical proof shows that team flow isn't just a metaphor for good collaboration. It is a totally unique, shared neurological brain state that is completely distinct from any other type of social interaction.
But, and this is a big but, mere physical proximity isn't nearly enough to trigger this interbrain synchrony. Team flow requires incredibly strict conditions. You absolutely must have a common purpose, complementary skills where everyone has a very specific role, and completely equal participation. But most crucially, there has to be a total blending of egos and a foundation of established, unshakable mutual trust. We call this psychological safety in the workplace. If you don't feel psychologically safe, your amygdala stays active, your sympathetic nervous system stays engaged in defense mode, and the collective prefrontal cortex will simply refuse to power down.
Let's bring this all home with Part 6, Mastering the Flow Cycle, Actionable Takeaways.
You see, flow is not a light switch you can just flick on whenever you want. It is a strict, 4-part neurological cycle. You literally cannot force it. Step 1 is the struggle phase. This is where you're loading the brain with information. It feels frustrating, your brainwaves are in high beta, and your cortisol is spiking. Step 2 is the release. You literally have to step away from the problem to let nitric oxide flush those stress hormones out of your system. Only then can you drop into Step 3, the actual flow state of transient hypofrontality. And finally, Step 4 is recovery. And listen, this phase is absolutely critical for healthy aging and sleep optimization. The flow state is highly catabolic, it breaks down tissue and burns through your reserves of serotonin and dopamine. Deep sleep, proper circadian alignment, and gut-healthy nutrition are biologically mandatory to repair your nervous system for the next cycle. If you skip the struggle or you neglect the recovery, the cycle breaks entirely.
So, to optimize this cycle in the real world, you need to ruthlessly manage your environment and your digital hygiene. You must cultivate triggers, like rich, uninterrupted solitude where you can connect ideas without distraction. You need activities that give you immediate, unambiguous feedback so your brain can constantly course-correct. Conversely, you have to aggressively eliminate the blockers. Information overload and constant digital pinging are catastrophic to human attention networks. A simple smartphone notification instantly pulls your brain out of the task-positive network and thrusts it violently back into that anxious default mode network, which forces you to restart that arduous struggle phase all over again.
At the end of the day, the science of peak performance ultimately comes down to biomechanical self-awareness. Your brain and your heart are equipped with the most sophisticated regulatory networks in the known universe. They are highly capable of incredible focus, neural synchrony, and effortless execution. But they require the right environment, the right challenges, and the courage to momentarily shut down your conscious control. So as you head back into your work, your hobbies, and your daily life, I want you to ask yourself a very serious question. Are you actively managing your brain's networks to unlock your optimal self, or are you just letting them manage you? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep chasing that sweet spot.